Salvete discipuli, hodie spectatis lecturam septendecimam, capitis septendecim, relative pronouns. Hodie discemus primum vocabula capitis septendecim, deinde grammaticam capitis, the relative pronouns qui, quae, quod, and their use. Primum discemus verba vocabulorum capitis septendecim. In hoc capite sunt novem verba: admitto, coipi, cupio, deleo, desidero, incipio, navigo, neglego, recito. Primum verbum: admitto, admittere, admissi, admissum. Amphitheatrum Flavium, quod Colosseum nunc appellamus, multa milia spectatorum admittebat. Quid significat admitto? Proximum verbum: coipi, coipisse, coiptum, et incipio, incipere, incepi, inceptum. Videte imaginem. In imagine est cursor incipit. Cursor incipit currere. Quid significat coipi et incipio? Proximum verbum: cupio, cupere, cupivi, cupitum. Bona vicini vestri non cupies, monet unum e decem praeceptis. Quid significat cupio? Proximum verbum: deleo, delere, delevi, deletum. Carthaginem delere debemus, clamavit Cato Maior in fine omnis orationis suae. Quid significat deleo? Carthago delendum est. Proximum verbum: desidero, desiderare, desideravi, desideratum. Ulixes in insula Calypsus vitam novem annos egit, et Ithacam suam revenira desideravit. Quid significat desidero? Proximum verbum: navigo, navigare, navigavi, navigatum. Mercurius Aeneam, qui in urbe Carthagine manebat, Italiam navigare iubet. Quid significat navigo? Ecce Mercurius, ecce Aeneas. Mercurius dicit: naviga Italiam, nunc statim. Proximum verbum: neglego, neglegere, neglexi, neglectum. Omnes in hoc convivio me neglegunt. Quid significat neglego? Ultimum verbum: recito, recitare, recitavi, recitatum. Vergilius Carmen de Marcello, qui nuper mortuus erat, recitabat, et mater eius Octavia non tolerare poterat. Quid significat recito? Nunc discemus nomina vocabulorum capitis septendecim. In hoc capite est unum nomen, libellus. Primum et ultimum nomen. Libellus, libelli. Libellum in manu meo teneo. Quid significat libellus? Libellus est parvus liber. Nunc discemus adjectiva vocabulorum capiti septembicim. In hoc capite sunt duo adjectiva, caecus, levis. Primum adjectivum, caecus, caeca, caecum. In fabulis Sophoclis, Tiresias fuit vates caecus, qui futurum videre potuit. Quid significat caecus? Ecce Tiresias. Tiresias est caecus. Caecus. Ultimum adjectivum. Levis, leve. Nix levis in terram cecidit. Quid significat levis? Nunc discemus alias partes loquendi vocabulorum capiti septembicim. In hoc capite sunt duo adverbia, cito, quoque, unum pronomen, qui, et una conjunctio, aut. Primum adverbium, cito. Ulixes cum viris suis a Cyclope cito navigant. Quid significat cito? Ultimum adverbium, quoque. Tu quoque est fallacia rationalis, qua homo mores tuos non argumentum oppugnat. Quid significat quoque? Pronomen qui quae quod est pronomen relativum. Tu quoque est fallacia rationalis, qua homo mores tuos non argumentum oppugnat. Quid significat qui? Conjunctio aut. Aut catapotium ausoreum aut rubrum capere potes. Optio enim est tua, dicit Morpheus. Quid significat aut? Ecce Morpheus, ecce catapotium rubrum, et catapotium ausoreum. Aut catapotium ausoreum aut rubrum capere potes. Optio est enim est tua, dicit Morpheus. Okay, so this is a watershed moment in this course because we are now starting to learn subordinate clauses. And the first type of subordinate clause we're going to learn is the relative clause. And the reason for that is they use the indicative mood, whereas other relative clauses that we'll learn later, probably next semester, use a subjunctive mood. Don't worry about that now. Okay? So what is a relative clause? Well, a relative clause is the second part of this sentence. I threw a ball which fell into the river. Okay? Picture the red cedar, if you will. A relative clause is a statement contained within a sentence that tells us more information about a word. That word is being the antecedent in the main sentence. Okay? So you can almost think of it as a whole kind of sub-sentence that gives you more information about a particular word. Okay? So the antecedent in this sentence is ball. And the rest of the sentence, after the comma here, is giving us more information about the ball. I threw a ball which fell into the river. Okay? What connects this relative clause, in other words, the second part of the sentence, to the first part of the sentence is the relative pronoun which. which is a pronoun which refers to the antecedent, which is ball. Okay, so I threw a ball which fell into the river. Also, the relative clause, the one that begins with which in this sentence, is what in grammatical terms we call a dependent clause. And a dependent clause cannot function on its own as an independent sentence, right? Which fell into the river is not a complete sentence. Okay, it has to be appended to an independent clause. Okay, the main statement, which is I threw a ball. Okay, so independent clause is I threw a ball. Dependent clause is which fell into the river. Okay, the first part of the sentence can be a statement on its own. The other cannot. Okay, so the relative pronoun is our first type of independent or subordinate clause that we will learn in this class. There's a lot more coming. Okay, so Latin functions the same way with relative pronouns, the equivalent of which or etc. So those are as follows. Okay, and they all start with QU. And you may notice that a lot of words in English that start with WH, like who, whose, which, what, okay, correspond to words in Latin that start with QU. Okay, so keep that pattern in mind. Okay, and so these all translate as which or whose or to whom, etc., etc. Okay. So a relative pronoun, okay, will decline in all three genders and both numbers, and they decline as follows. So qui, quai, quod is who. Cuius, cuius, cuius is whose or of whom. Cui, cui, cui is to whom or to which. Okay, quem, quab, quod is the accusative. Quo, qua, quo is the ablative. Okay, and then in the plural, right, we have the same, but in the plural. You'll notice that relative pronouns decline very similarly to many of the pronouns we've learned already, many of the demonstrative pronouns, as well as similarities to the IUS adjective, right? For example, you have the IUS in the genitive, and you have the I in the dative, and then you have 2-1-2 looking endings in the accusative and ablative, but over here we have a bit of differences. We have 2-1-2 looking endings in the genitive plural and the accusative plural, but in the dative and ablative plural we have, well, third declension looking endings, those ibuses. Okay, so it's a mix of various elements we've learned already in kind of a new configuration, but they should be pretty easy to spot for now because, you know, they start with QU. Okay? All right, let's see how they work in context. Now, here is one example sentence. Brutus gladium conservavit, quo Caesarem ceciderat. Okay, and this means Brutus kept, Brutus kept the sword with which he had killed Caesar. Okay, Brutus kept the sword with which he had killed Caesar. Or if you want more Germanic English, Brutus killed the sword that he killed Caesar with. Okay, so the independent clause, the part of the sentence that can stand on its own is the first part. Brutus gladium conservavit. Brutus kept the sword. Okay, and then what starts with the quo is the independent clause, the subordinate clause. Sorry, is the dependent clause, the subordinate clause by which he had killed Caesar. Okay, so the quo in the second part of the sentence in the subordinate clause is the relative pronoun, okay? And it is referring to the sword, to the gladius here, okay? Now, here's how relative pronouns work. Since they are referring to an antecedent, okay, they must match the antecedent in gender and number. So gladius, gladii, the word for sword, is masculine, and it's singular. However, the relative pronoun does not need to match its antecedent in case. So, Brutus gladium conservavit. The gladium is in the first part of the sentence is accusative. It's the direct object of konservavit. Okay? The quo in the subordinate clause, in the relative clause, is not accusative. It's ablative. It's ablative of means here, by which he had killed Caesar. Okay? So, again, the relative pronoun must agree in gender and number with the antecedent. However, it does not need to agree in case. And the reason for that is we have a new kind of subject verb statement in the relative clause. Okay, we have a new set of grammar that doesn't have any effect on the grammar of the main clause, if you will. See how that works? Okay. Here's another example. Often, and this works in English as well, a relative clause set off by a relative pronoun may be sandwiched within the main clause. In other words, the main clause may have kind of almost a parenthetical relative clause within it. So here's an example. Caesar quem Brutus necaverat, Deus factus est. So this translates as Caesar, whom Brutus had killed, was made a god. Okay, he was deified. So this sentence still has a main clause, an independent clause, as well as a subordinate relative clause. The main clause, however, is interrupted by the relative clause. So the main clause, the independent clause, is Caesar Deus factus est. Caesar was made a god, was made into a god. And then the relative clause, which is just dropped into the sentence, is whom Brutus had killed. Okay? So when you kind of read a sentence that has a relative clause in it, I encourage you to identify where the relative clause begins and ends and bracket it off. Okay? That way you can see the main clause in better perspective here, right? So you can't always just read words left to right and expect it to make sense, as you've gotten used to now, right? Especially since the subject and the verb tend to be on opposite ends of the sentence, and so naturally a relative clause might go in between. So get used to that. Also, a relative clause might begin the sentence, and then the main clause will end it. So it really depends on what's good style. So that's it. We'll have plenty of practice with this. Okay. Also, just notice, by the way, the antecedent is Caesar, and so Caesar is masculine singular. It's the relative clause referring to Caesar is also masculine singular. However, Caesar here is nominative. He's the subject of the sentence. But the relative clause, okay, the relative pronoun referring to him is accusative, right? Because Brutus is the subject here. Okay, so another example of how the relative pronoun doesn't need to match its antecedent in case, just gender and number. Okay? All right. See you next time. Volete discipuli.